I'm Laura Murray, and I'm the president of the National Museum of Language. So I'm going to give you a short introduction to the National Museum of Language because we find that in many cases, people sign up for our presentations are not really familiar with who we are. So this will just be brief. The National Museum of Language is a unique, fully virtual museum, which means we don't have a building. We operate as a nonprofit 501c3 museum. We're dedicated to examining the history, impact, and art of language. And as a nonprofit, the museum is guided by its mission and is supported by members, donors, and volunteers. I'm going to read you our mission statement. The National Museum of Language honors and supports language acquisition, utilization, and preservation, along with linguistic and cultural diversity. Through our outreach activities and online resources, we celebrate the magic and beauty of human communication. About the museum itself, the National Museum of Language is a small museum that explores the transformative powers of language. We opened to the public on May 3rd, 2008, after more than 10 years in the making. We are a trailblazer in the field. There are no more than 3 museums in the world that have a similar focus. The museum examines the history, impact, and art of language. And when we say there are no other similar museums, we look at language rather broadly. There are a lot of language museums around the world, but most of them focus on a single language, the language of the country where the museum is located. It's the most common situation. But we look more broadly across languages worldwide. We offer a wide range of exhibits and resources from language experts, students, and the general public. Most of our exhibits that are on our website are multilingual, featuring content in the original language as well as English translation. Examples of our exhibits include children's stories, poetry, and international humor. We have a robust speaker program on a wide variety of topics, from vampires to endangered languages. And all our past speaker programs are recorded and are available on our website if you missed them when they were first presented. We have a lot of connections that help us stay abreast of what's going on in the language museum world or language world. We are a member of the American Alliance of Museums and the International Network of Language Museums. We collaborate with experts from numerous educational institutions and research organizations. So that is the quick summary of the museum. You're welcome to put some questions in the chat, which we can address at a later point in the evening's presentation. All right, with that, I will turn this back over to Emily to continue with the program.
Great, thank you. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Greg to give us an introduction to our speaker.
Okay, I too will be brief, and I just have to say we hit the jackpot this time because we have a speaker who can talk about any number of things. Basically, as Dr. Murray said, we're involved with language preservation, and he's going to be talking today about Welsh, but he could just as easily talk about Cantonese or Hawaiian. He could talk about China. I mean, you know, he's in Hong Kong now. He is the Asian correspondent for the Canadian National newspaper. At least I believe it is, the Globe, the Mail. I think that's out of Toronto. And more to the point, he has a very popular book called Speak Not: Empire, Identity, and the Politics of Language, which is about the very topic that he's going to be talking about today, except he's going to focus specifically on Welsh. So again, we could have him here for any number of topics, and it's our true honor to have him here, and we're glad that he could accommodate us with his schedule from Hong Kong. All right, that's all I wanted to say. So I will pass on the mic to, I guess, back to Emily.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And we will be getting to our excellent speaker in just a moment. Just a couple of logistical notes on the program before we get started. You are welcome to be on camera or off camera, whatever you're comfortable with. We do ask that if you're not speaking, you keep yourself muted to avoid any noise transfer, background sound. We're going to be hearing the presentation for, I think, about 45 minutes or so. We do ask that you go ahead and drop questions in the chat. We'll have the presentation, and then we will take a short break of about 5 minutes, and then come back, and we will have the Q&A session and a general discussion after that. So again, please do drop your questions in the chat, and we will get to them after the formal presentation, as well as any questions you might have about the museum. If you're having any technical difficulties with sound or anything like that, feel free to send me a message in the chat or Jill. And with that, I will give it to Mr. Griffiths to get us started.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Great, well, thank you for having me this evening. Really happy to speak to the museum. Obviously, appreciate the important work that is done on the front of language preservation. It's great to have an institution like this kind of set up for that purpose and to host events like this. I will, Greg basically introduced me. Yeah, as said, I'm the Asia correspondent for the Globe and Mail. I'm the author of this book, Speak Not, Empire, Identity, and the Politics of Language, which explores the histories and stories of specifically Welsh, Hawaiian, and Cantonese, with divergences into looking at Afrikaans, Yiddish, and a couple of other languages. And I was kind of inspired to write this due to similarities I saw after living in Hong Kong for a number of years between the situation and the concerns around Cantonese and those that I grew up with around my kind of mother tongue, which is Welsh. And so I'm from Ynys Môn, Anglesey in North Wales, but I've lived in Asia for the past 14 years, so I've been away for a long time. Just to kind of give an overview of the presentation that I will give, I'll give a brief introduction to the language itself, because I appreciate that lots of people aren't really familiar with Welsh, especially outside of the UK. I'll talk about how it was historically suppressed, and then also go into the resurgence that we've seen in recent decades. And then I'll take questions, and like Greg said, I can talk about a number of topics. I'm going to focus in my presentation on Welsh, but I'm happy to answer questions about about Cantonese, about Hawaiian, though my expertise on Hawaiian is less, and I'm less familiar with it since I finished writing the book, or also just kind of more broadly around language preservation and revitalization, especially kind of in the day of AI and rapidly changing technology, about how we do especially online language preservation. As I'm sure people who would, watch this kind of talk are familiar with, we are in a kind of rather dire situation for a lot of languages around the world, with, some, the majority of the world language, thousands of world languages are, either minoritized or are endangered and facing potential extinction. We're shifting to a situation in a lot of countries, a lot of regions where the majority of the population speak one language or one of a handful of languages. As that says on the slide, we're getting to a point where more than a quarter of the global population are speakers of just 4 languages, which is a massive change to most of history. The story of Welsh, it was historically, even when I was growing up in the 90s and 2000s, was always seen as kind of a almost like a negative example of a historical language, because it was always seen that this was a language that was endangered and was kind of headed for extinction. But at that time, despite the fact that there was a lot of fear at the time and a lot of skepticism about the future of Welsh around that time, that was a period actually of resurgence, kind of beginning from the 1980s onwards. As you can see on that chart, we started to tick up with the number of Welsh speakers, and Welsh now is really widely seen, both within the Celtic language community, but also the kind of global minority language community, Welsh is really seen as an inspiration and a potential lesson for other languages, a kind of object lesson of how to revitalize and lead a language resurgence. And so, I'll talk a bit about Welsh, but a lot of this stuff is similar to both to Welsh, but also especially to how other languages in the UK were also suppressed. So as well as Welsh, we have kind of Cornish and Gaelic in Scotland and some other languages as well. This photo is Llyn Bwllhwyd and Llyn Idwal, which is in Snowdonia. It's just across from where I grew up. To introduce Welsh a little bit, Cymraeg is how we say it in Welsh. Actually, the word Welsh, the word Wales, comes from the Anglo-Saxon. It just means foreigner, and it's this rather bizarre situation where the original British inhabitants of the UK, of Britain, are referred to by a word that means foreigner, despite the fact that the people who put that word on them came from overseas. But Cymraeg is how we say it in Welsh. It is an Indo-European language that kind of gives an idea on the slide of the family tree there. So it's Indo-European. There is, eventually a shared root with English, but quite a long way back. It's part of the Brythonic. It's part of the Celtic family, which branches off into Brythonic and Goidelic. Brythonic is Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. Breton is a very tiny minority language that is spoken in Brittany, in northern France, and that is as a result of ancient British settlers going across around a similar time as the Anglo-Saxon conquest. Cornish is obviously spoken in Cornwall, Cymraeg. That is undergoing something of a revitalization now. It did technically die. There were no native speakers for a period, but it has been revived, and there are efforts to kind of increase the visibility and level of Cornish spoken. But Welsh is by far the healthiest, both Brythonic language and healthiest Celtic language generally. Irish has seen a resurgence in the Republic in recent years, and even in the north of Ireland more recently, there has been an increase in the number of schools teaching Irish. But it's still, I think it's around half of the number of speakers of Welsh, despite being a larger country. So Welsh has been seen as real success, depending on how you categorize speakers. There are kind of anywhere between 500,000 and a million, probably 500,000 when we're talking real regular use. And as you can see on this kind of heat map, that is mostly in the northwest. So the island at the top is Ynys Môn, Anglesey, which is where I'm from, and that is kind of the heart of the Welsh-speaking community in Wales. And then as you go down towards the southeast, towards the English border and the kind of populated centre of Wales, and that's where the capital city is as well, that becomes a lot more English-speaking. But there is also, there is Welsh language schools there, and there has been a resurgence in recent years. The diaspora Welsh community is rather tiny. We're probably talking less than 50,000 people. The only other kind of Welsh-speaking community outside of Wales is in Oladva, which is a settlement in Argentina, which was originally settled by Welsh settlers during the 1800s, and was intended as a kind of Welsh colony. And that is in Patagonia, but that is primarily a Spanish-speaking community, but a lot of people do speak Welsh as a heritage language, and there is, a decent amount of language exchange still between Wales and Oladva. Welsh language itself is we use a Latin alphabet, but with a few kind of extra letters. So we have you can see the double letters on the slide. So DD, which is the FF. And then the more complicated one that people struggle with is LL, which is there are various sounds that don't really exist in English, which is why people struggle. It is also, we have extra vowels, which is why you often see English speakers claim that Welsh words don't have vowels, but it's because we use things like Y as a vowel and W. And also to create confusion for language learners, we do have, especially English language learners, we do have feminine and masculine in the language. We use a verb subject object order rather than SVO, and words can mutate depending on the one before them, so it becomes quite difficult. As you see on the slide, gan, which means have, can become gen, ganddo, genchi, depending on the context, and so it is quite complicated, even for a learner sometimes to work out what people are saying, depending on the kind of grammar of the sentence they're using. Just some examples of Welsh. Rwy'n Gymro, dwi'n siarad Cymraeg. I'm a Welsh person, I speak Welsh. Lle mae'r toilet? Where's the toilet? And then just to show off, because this is especially people from North Wales, this is our party trick, is par ffordd sy'n mynd I Llamar Pwllgwyn Gichog Erin Wyn Drobol Llantysilio Goch, which is the longest place name in Europe. And that is a town that's on my driving license. That's the closest town to where I grew up. Unfortunately, it is not the kind of beautiful historic name that people often assume it might be. It was invented in the Victorian era as a tourist trap and has been a tourist trap ever since. So there's not that much tradition. Well, I guess there's a couple of 100 years of tradition at this point, but it's it's not some kind of druidic name. It's just a Victorian extension of an existing name in order to put it on a sign and get people to come and buy things. Brythonic languages are date back to the Celtic settlements of the UK, so the kind of what we can kind of see as an indigenous language of Britain, and were the dominant language of Britain until the Anglo-Saxon conquest. Even during the Roman era, while people did pick up Latin and Latin was used as a language of administration, Brythonic continued to be spoken throughout mainland Britain. That changes with the Anglo-Saxon conquest, first obviously beginning in kind of southeast England, but then spreading throughout the country, and you see the loss of these Brythonic-speaking kingdoms. So both throughout what is now England, particularly up in Northumbria, in the northwest, and then the Pictish kingdoms also are wiped out by as Irish settlers come over and replaced by Gaelic. And after that, we have spoken at the periphery, Welsh, Cumbric, which obviously no longer exists, Pictish, which no longer exists, and Cornish, or Canoag. Welsh, because Wales was not really settled and not fully conquered by the English until relatively late in history, Welsh did persevere. And then through into the 1800s, mainly thanks to kind of geographic isolation, Wales was not kind of heavily settled until the Industrial Revolution. And then as Welsh coal becomes a key part of the global Industrial Revolution, we see a huge number of English immigrants come into Wales, Irish immigrants as well, and that also starts to become the suppression of the language kind of goes hand in hand with growing worker unrest in Wales as a way to control this increasingly economically important part of the country. And that Welsh was seen, along with several other things, Welsh was seen as potentially a way that people could organise against English capital. And then this began to be a concern. And we start to see in the mid-19th century, a number of slow suppression, particularly in the southeast. Language schools stopped teaching Welsh, switched to English. Sorry, that's a typo on the slide. It should be 1847. But there's a very notorious report on the state of education in Wales, carried out by English officials, none of whom could speak Welsh, but they decided that the Welsh language was a, quote, vast drawback to Wales and a manifold barrier to the moral progress and commercial prosperity of the people. And this report is called the Revitalization, the treachery of the Blue Books, and it's notorious in Wales for it's seen as kind of the start of the real aggressive suppression of the language. Ironically, at the time, it didn't actually provoke as much outrage about its attitude to the language as it did its attitude to Welsh religion, because Wales, historically, since the Reformation, Wales was a home of nonconformist Protestant religion. So Wales is where a lot of the A lot of Quakers come from and spread around the world, a lot of Baptists. And so this was seen as much of a problem as the Welsh language was these people who weren't proper Anglicans living in their small villages in Wales and being uncivilized. And so with the Resurgence, you see both a suppression of the Welsh language and also a kind of more aggressive promotion of Anglicanism as the state religion. And that happens very quickly, as I imagine people know, the degree, the speed at which a language can decline is dramatic. You only really need one generation. And with the suppression of Welsh beginning in the 1800s, by 1911, there's a census, and we see that Welsh has become a minority language in the first time, and so a lot of that is because of suppression, though there is also a degree to which there has been mass immigration from England in particular, which obviously has changed the demographics of the language spoken in the country. But then it continues to go down through the 1900s. Every census reports a decline until around 1980 something. And there was a real sense that this was headed into terminal decline. This was widely discussed at the time, but in a lot of, especially in the English language media and within government, it was seen as an inevitability and even something that they weren't necessarily doing themselves. That there was a lot of kind of, especially obviously around the mid 1900s, you have a lot of kind of cultural Darwinism, which is coming into force, so it's seen as a less civilized language, which would inevitably die out, and so didn't need to be preserved. There are also kind of attitudes which we see around other languages, which is this idea that even within the language communities themselves, they assume that because the language is spoken in the home, that you don't necessarily need to promote it in schools. You see a lot of Welsh parents are encouraging their children to learn English and focus on just studying English because that was the language of the state, it was the language of the economy and prosperity. And there was an assumption that it's fine, we speak Welsh at home, it will continue to go on. But as has happened in language communities all over the world, the problem is you have your parent, the first generation speak Welsh, speak it to their kids. Second generation speak Welsh at home, but learn English in school. And then when they come to have children, they don't speak enough of the language or feel comfortable enough in the language that they pass it on to their children. And then within just 2 or 3 generations, you then have a language break and the language is not passed on. So that Welsh was headed towards terminal decline. There was a number of incidents which sparked anger in Wales and did start to see a movement spring up for preserving the Welsh language, which eventually became Cymdeithas y Iaith, the Welsh Language Society. And they started a both peaceful and kind of non-violent resistance organization. And then there was also very kind of little known, even in Wales today, there was a terrorist campaign as well, militant action, bombings of railways, bombing of the Prince, now King Charles's investiture at Carnarvon Castle. And there was concern at the time within cabinet. There was concern that this was becoming a potentially going to be a more serious terrorist threat, especially as you have this is happening concurrent with mass protests throughout Wales. One of the turning points in this history, or the kind of radicalizing moments, is there is what is now a reservoir in North Wales, where I'm from, which was a valley and was home to an almost 100% Welsh-speaking community, Capel Celyn, and that was decided to flood that valley to create a reservoir to pump water across the border for drinking water in the city of Liverpool. And this was kind of such an obvious, no Welsh MP supported this plan. Welsh communities, Welsh local government didn't support this plan, but it was imposed by the British/English government over their heads. And this was a kind of such an outrageous overstep of colonial authority that it really did spark a concerted protest movement. This photo is people protesting in Liverpool itself. There were protests across the country, and it remains it remains a kind of point of pride in Wales. Cofiwch Dyrerin, which is Tryweryn was the valley, and it's seen as kind of a symbol of English colonialism in Wales, and particularly also now is very associated with language suppression because this was a Welsh-speaking community. Following the drowning of Tryweryn in 65, you see more and more people joining Cymdeithas movements, as well as kind of public protests. They did things like refusing to pay taxes unless they received them in Welsh and other government documents. They also vandalized road signs, and so you start to see a push towards having bilingual road signs, and then also in the 1970s there was another terrorist arson campaign targeting English second homes, particularly in North Wales on the Llŷn Peninsula, where you have a number of homes, and it still remains a problem today, the quantity of holiday homes in that region driving up house prices, and a lot of them were empty for the majority of the year, and there was an arson campaign targeting them and torching hundreds of properties, and that actually has never been solved. That the one person was arrested in connection with it, but they think there were probably dozens of people involved, and the majority of them have never been arrested. This, obviously the British government does not admit that they were influenced by violent campaigns or even protests, but we can see, thanks to declassified cabinet documents, you can see that the Thatcher government at the time was really concerned that the direction that Wales was becoming, and this is at the height of the Troubles, the Civil War in the north of Ireland, and there was a real fear that Wales could become, probably never as violent as the north of Ireland, because there is, not the kind of intercommunal tension there, but there was a fear that it could become chaotic, that you could see, more arsons, more bombings, more mass protests, and there was also a sense in the Thatcher government that this was potentially a wedge issue that they could use to gain support in Wales. Wales has been historically the most left-wing part of the UK. It's almost consistently voted for originally Liberal and then since the kind of 1950s Labour candidates. And the Conservatives have very, very scant foothold in Wales, particularly at that time. And there was a sense that this could be a way for the Conservatives to get support in Wales, increase that. And so we see the Thatcher government support the creation of a Welsh public television channel, S4C. And then in 1988, which is the year that I was born, they support educational reforms to make Welsh a compulsory language. And this is basically that educational reform is basically the start of the Welsh language resurgence. That's the most important thing that happened for the language in probably the last 100 years. And ironically, it really complicates the legacy of Thatcher in Wales, because Margaret Thatcher is, widely seen as a figure of hate in Wales for cracking down on the miners' strike and putting a lot of Welsh communities out of work during the miners' strike and in the years since. But she is also the Prime Minister that really shored up the Welsh language at a time when it was headed potentially towards extinction. So it's a very complicated legacy that we still kind of grapple with. Sorry. This then becomes a bit of a, self-propelling resurgence, because as you increase visibility, you create greater support for Welsh language protection and Welsh language promotion. You can find a lot of media coverage at the time, columnists, particularly obviously in English newspapers, complaining about, we're wasting money on having these road signs that are in English and Welsh. This doesn't do anything. This is just, they would, this is far too early to use the term woke, but they would, presumably use the term woke if they were writing about it nowadays. But actually, it does have a major effect, that this visibility of Welsh, like, real literal visibility as you're driving around, you're seeing the Welsh language. encourages people, Anglo-Welsh people and English immigrants, to want to learn a bit of the language, to, you know, to have a sense that the language exists even. You know, previously you could live in, you know, almost entirely Anglicized part of the South, particularly the Southeast, and maybe not, you know, not appreciate that there is this language, other language in this country that is widely spoken and has been spoken for, you know, thousands of years. And so we start to see polling change and support for Welsh as a language and promoting Welsh really improve. Obviously, this is, you know, more pronounced in the Welsh-speaking areas in the Northwest, but we see it improve across the country. Until we get to a point today where everything in Wales is the only part of the UK that has an official language. The official languages of Wales are English and Welsh, whereas the rest of the UK has a de facto official language of English, but doesn't have any laws protecting it. And so we do have a, you know, bilingual as law. So all government services have to be provided in Welsh. Government documents, all of our road signs are in Welsh, and you know, it is. You still have a situation where lots of politicians, and particularly kind of national level politicians, will maybe not speak Welsh, but it is getting to a point where it's starting to become difficult, particularly for someone to say want to become the First Minister of Wales. If they don't speak Welsh, if they aren't a Welsh speaker, you know, they're at least kind of obliged to say, I'm learning Welsh and I'm trying my best. And a lot of that has been, you know, accelerated by, in 97, Welsh voters voted for Home Rule, and they created those devolution of powers to Wales and created the National Assembly, which has been it's been renamed the Senedd, and it's been given increasing powers. And, you know, this is a similar thing that we see in Scotland and in the north of Ireland as well. Cofiwch Drone, yeah. This, because there is a Welsh government, and we've had since Wales was powers devolved to Wales in 97. Labour have won every single election since then, and have always formed the government, sometimes in coalition, but they've always formed the government in Wales since then. They have set out, this Cymraeg 2050 strategy, which is looking to get a million Welsh speakers. It's actually ahead of target for that, so that is really encouraging. It is well underway. There's also been a kind of increased pride in Wales of Welsh when I was growing up, because I think maybe also because we're a farming community in North Wales. Welsh was kind of seen as quite old-fashioned and parochial, and, you know, was associated with things like Eisteddfodau, which are kind of traditional poetry and song competitions, and was, you know, a little bit quaint and not really cool. But that has really changed in the last couple of decades. You see a lot more Welsh language bands, musicians. Espadrec, which is the Welsh language broadcaster, has kind of modernized and produces really, you know, solid dramas and comedies and things, and so that you can kind of consume all kinds of culture in Welsh, which then helps keep it a living language and a kind of language that people want to speak and be associated with. And we're starting to see also as kind of an evolution of that effort to have Welsh on signs. We're now, you know, starting to move Welsh kind of above English as the kind of primary language and English as the bilingual language, and so, you know, adopt the Welsh names of things. So you know, refer to the country more as Cymru rather than Wales. Banna Brycheiniog is now the official name of the Brecon Beacons, or, you know, reverting to the original name. Eryri, which is Snowdon, which is the highest mountain in England and Wales. That's where I'm from. It's just across from where I'm from, that using the Senedd, you know, changing all these things to Welsh. That does meet with some protest by people, but it is, you know, again, it's an important factor and a kind of an underappreciated effect when it comes to promoting the language and especially increasing its visibility. Plaid Cymru, which is the nationalist party in Wales, currently are on track. Polling shows that they potentially will form the next Welsh government, where the Labour vote has collapsed as a result of kind of UK-wide political kind of disengagement with Labour. So there is potential for, you know, a real staunch Welsh nationalist aggressively promoting of Welsh party to form the next government. Though the flip side of that is that they potentially, we could also see a reform government coming to Wales, which is a far right party, which is very aggressively anti-Welsh language policy, and so could roll a lot of that back. So it's kind of teetering on the edge currently in the next couple of years about what direction government policy will go with Welsh. But also there has been increased, particularly with the rise of Plaid, there has been increased support within Wales for potentially for independence at some point from the UK. That's still nowhere near kind of the level of support we see for independence in Scotland, and potentially Wales may never reach a point where majority support independence, but it is gone from single digit percentages to kind of 30+% of support. So this has been a real shift, and part of that is because of the degree to which Welsh, having a language that separates us from the rest of the UK, kind of distinguishes people and kind of highlights for people that we live in, we are a separate nation to the rest of Britain, and we are a distinct nation, and that I think has supported and kind of driven support for potentially for independence. The major lessons, as I said, for the Resurgence of Welsh, education policy was the single most important thing that happened. Getting Welsh back into schools in 1988 was a huge paradigm shifting moment for the language. We basically see continual decline until that point, and then you see resurgence, that it's never enough to have just language in the community, just language in the home. You have to have language in schools. You have to have children being taught in the language, and ideally it be the language of the playground as well. And that really beds that language in with the young people, and creates a generation of people who will then pass on that language. Visibility pays off as well, as I mentioned, with the road signs, with Espadrec, with all government forms and things like that being bilingual. That increases visibility, increases kind of the importance and legitimacy of the language, and also encourages English speakers or foreign immigrants to want to potentially pick up the language. Political organizing, this is kind of a real success story for a minoritized community within the wider UK and within the British Empire, of political organizing working and paying off. And also that you have to have cultural products. So I don't think Welsh would have survived had it just been purely education, even though obviously education is the most important factor, but you also have to have things like S4C, which was a real huge moment, that there were hunger protests and things around getting S4C, because people understood that to have culture produced in language. We have soap operas. One of the longest running soap operas in the world is a Welsh language soap opera, Pobl y Cwm. We have music, we have newspapers, books, everything in Welsh, and that allows people to consume culture in Welsh and sustain their own language by consuming that culture. And Welsh has become, as I mentioned at the beginning, Welsh has become an inspiration, a potential kind of model for a lot of other language movements in the world, both in the kind of Celtic sphere in Cornwall, Brittany, in Ireland, but also in New Zealand, especially. There's been a lot of learning from Welsh. Catalonia, there's in northeast Spain, there is sharing of kind of tactics with Welsh, and we saw that with Basque as well, and even in Hawaii, which is another one of the languages I looked at in my book. There was kind of people knew about Welsh and had kind of looked at the way that people in Wales had brought their language back from the brink, and were trying to learn those lessons and apply them in Hawaii as well. And this is an advantage now, because obviously with the internet and with the kind of awareness of language endangerment and revitalization projects, people are much more organized and sharing things. I was struck that when I was doing interviews for this book, I spoke to an academic at Bangor University who actually went to the same high school that I did. And we talked about the fact that, when we were learning this language and, in the 90s and 2000s, that it was still seen as something that was kind of somewhat unique to Wales, that it wasn't necessarily connected with a global minority language community, and not even really with the wider Celtic community. And so now I think there is a real inspiration in that solidarity of this is a number of communities around the world doing this, and encouragement that this, you take example and inspiration from other languages. And I think that's why it's also important to speak about the success of Welsh, because this is a tiny community of a few 100,000 people that has now grown, pushing 1 million people. But we're still, as a country as a whole, we're only 3 million people. So we're a tiny little country, but we have seen genuine success at revitalizing a language and showing how that can be done and should be done around the world. So that is just to crassly promote my book, but that is kind of a very brief overview of the Welsh language section of the book, which again also looks at Hawaiian and Chinese. The idea is to look at kind of 3 languages on the edge of 3 imperial projects that and then how they've reacted to how they kind of responded to that. So Welsh as a language which was suppressed but has revitalized and is now in kind of rude health. Hawaiian, which is a language which is very much on the edge and could go either direction. There has been a huge effort to revitalize Hawaiian and improve it, embed it in, but it's very kind of still threatened, and there is potential for it to decline still. And then Cantonese, it's the language which is spoken here in Hong Kong, is a language that is statistically in very, very strong health. We've got millions of speakers around the world, but the only first language community at this point is in Hong Kong, and that is only 7 million people. And so that's a relatively small first language community. It is threatened by policies from mainland China, which have already taken place in mainland China and suppressed and marginalized a lot of non-Mandarin languages in mainland China. Were the same thing to happen in Hong Kong, and were Cantonese to become a second language or even a minority language in Hong Kong, you would very rapidly see decline internationally, because while there is a very strong diaspora Cantonese community, diasporas typically don't produce culture, they are consumers of it. And so if you lost this core first language community here in Hong Kong, that could have a real pronounced threat on the survival of Cantonese abroad. So that's the idea was the book was to look at 3 languages which are in very different situations. So I'll take a break there. I think we take a break, but afterwards I'm happy to answer questions around about Welsh and what I discussed, but also I can talk about the other languages in the book, Hawaiian, Cantonese, other minority languages. Quite a lot of the book also looks at modern ways of preserving languages and organizing around languages. Happy to talk about all of that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Yes, we will go ahead and take a short break now. And I see that we have received a good number of questions in the chat. So I think our first couple of questions are from Greg, if you'd like to go ahead and ask.
Okay, yes, this isn't so much a question as I wanted to know what Mr. Griffiths knows about the use of Welsh as a co-talking language. We know this is an area that I know a fair amount about because I've given talks myself on the Native Americans' use of co-talking in World War II. And I know that the Welsh was used in World War II as well as in Bosnia and in the Falklands. And it seems to me it would be pretty effective, but I've never really heard much about how that came about. Is this something that you know anything about, Mr. Griffiths?
It's not something I've looked into yet. I've heard this and read this in the past. I think probably the British Army does use some Welsh as codes. I doubt there is. I think it's probably overstated the degree to which it's used officially, just because of the kind of number of Welsh speakers there are nationally in the rest of the UK. I think probably, especially in World War One, there was a lot of Welsh, like native Welsh speaking in soldiers, who I'm sure we're using it in the trenches, but I don't think we're using it for. And there's a lot of Welsh poetry comes out of World War One, but I don't think they were necessarily using it as a code language so much. I could be wrong. I could be being overly skeptical about that. But what I will say is it's kind of related to that is Welsh speakers have for years taken advantage of the fact that this is a language that's barely spoken outside of Wales to speak it in public in other parts of the world and use it as a language that people around you can't understand. My sister and I always used to speak Welsh to each other when we were on holiday, so that we could, kind of be rude little children gossiping about people around us. And I have heard, but I've also heard horror stories from friends of, speaking in Welsh and complaining about someone near you, and then they turn around and are also a Welsh tourist and understood everything you say. Um, I was always struck by a Chinese teacher of mine once commented that English speakers have no privacy because essentially everyone in the world can speak a little bit of English, and almost wherever you are, people can understand what you're saying. Whereas if you speak a, true minority language, and especially a like regional minority language, you are much kind of safer in speaking that all over the world.
Okay, thank you. I would agree that it's since it is so well known that it wouldn't have much effectiveness as a co-talking language. The other question I have is, you may have covered this. If you did, I missed it. I'm sorry. But that the the flag of Wales has that dragon on it. What's the history there?
So dragons have been used as a symbol in Wales, I think basically since like time immemorial, as it were. There isn't kind of a first what there isn't a clear first one, but they are seen as a symbol from very early on. You see them as they're a Brythonic symbol that they used by kingdoms fighting the Anglo-Saxons, and then they become associated with kind of Welsh kingdoms, particularly the Kingdom of Gwynedd, which Gwynedd is kind of northwest Wales. And that was kind of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Wales. You have when the Principality, when you see the shift from the Principality being a Welsh kingdom to being a principality of the Kingdom of England, there is a kind of co-option of the Welsh dragon as a kind of symbol of that principality, and then also that is increased when you have a Welsh, well, or at least Welsh-born king, Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry the Seventh. You see he uses the Welsh dragon as well, and that becomes more of an
Oh,
important kind of
okay.
national level symbol. Yeah, and it's interesting. There is a number of things that are kind of originally Welsh Brythonic, which are kind of adopted into English. The most kind of notorious of those is like the Arthur myth. King Arthur as a figure, or Arthur as a figure, was historically fought the Anglo-Saxons, but is kind of nowadays seen by a lot of people in England as kind of an English mythical figure. Despite the fact that he, if he existed, which he probably didn't, but he's inspired by people who fought the English and has since kind of become a part of like English Romance literature.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think our next question is from Gary. If you'd like to come on and ask your question.
Sure, I'm here. Hi, I noticed on the map that you've actually showing to us right now is that there are some apparently heavily Welsh-speaking areas, particularly around the northern part of the country. And I'm just wondering why it wasn't more widespread.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
whatever.
so basically what you're looking at is kind of a level of ruralness is essentially what's driving that. So in the southeast, which is the kind of least Welsh-speaking area, that's where the mining valleys are. That's where industrial Wales is. And then as you go up towards the northwest, it becomes less and less urban and more rural, more remote. So the Llŷn Peninsula, which is the kind of thing that looks a bit like an arm that's sticking out, pointing out towards the left. That's quite remote and is even today. I mean, it's not even really farming at that point. It's just largely kind of rolling hills and a few sparse villages. And so it basically, the more rural, the more remote areas were, the less English penetrated them historically. And so that's basically what you're seeing is that these are various parts of the country that are quite difficult to think. You can also see, so there is a mountain range which basically kind of bisects Wales down the middle, and you can see that very clearly on the map, where to the west of that mountain range, which is more rural and more remote, you have stronger Welsh speaking communities. To the east of that language range, you have much more English spoken.
Okay.
Emily,
Yes.
there's a question from the person in the on the phone. Whiten, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, this is Wang. I actually have a copy of your book, and I read in the section of Cantonese that language can survive only if it's used in government, in two other areas. And I'm wondering whether you've considered arts, in terms of music.
I think that okay.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for buying the book. Yeah, it's incredibly important, and that's kind of, as I was saying, with the importance of having a community of the language which is generating culture, and this is particularly kind of pertinent with Cantonese and with Hong Kong, that you have to have a culture created in the language, both so that people have something that they can consume and kind of immerse themselves in. Obviously, it's important to be speaking the language, but you're not speaking it all the time. You want to be able to read and listen and feel that culture, and it's hugely important. And so to lose that can have a real marked effect. And I think I felt this as a younger person speaking Welsh, that Welsh to me was a language that I spoke in school, was not really kind of something I consumed as much, and part of that was because that culture was still quite old-fashioned and wasn't really kind of keeping up with the times, wasn't changing. And my understanding now is that there's been a marked difference, and that people really are kind of consuming a lot of culture, and Cantonese obviously has always been far ahead of that. Canto pop was kind of a global phenomenon, around Asia, and kind of Hong Kong dramas were kind of the original K-dramas in Asia and even further afield. So that has historically been a very strong kind of base for the Cantonese language, but it still is starting to shift as you see more Mandarin language production within Hong Kong, and kind of a diminution of the amount of Cantonese that's used here. So that could be something that changes dramatically.
Thanks. And I want to just add, so I speak two dialects of Chinese, Cantonese and Toisanese. I also speak Japanese. And when I studied Japanese, I realized that the phonetic readings, the onyomi in Japanese, actually is a lot closer to Toisanese than to Cantonese. So I was born in Hong Kong, and I grew up in America basically. But my parents would always refer to historical events and so forth, and there's a lot of writing. I mean, Chinese history goes back 5,000 years, and the literature goes back at least 2,000, right? And so the Cantonese people pride themselves on being the posterity of the Tang Dynasty. Okay, in fact, the name for Chinatown in Cantonese is the streets of the Tang people. I don't know whether you knew that.
Mm. Yeah, and even like an interesting thing of that is here in Hong Kong we have kind of the native breed of dog we call Tongao, which like is Tang dog. Even though even though you don't really even use Tang, you wouldn't use Tang in other contexts, but it kind of, you have these like historical associations where it's still there as
my grandmother spoke Toisanese, and she would ask the young children born in America, does he speak Tonghua, Tang language as opposed to Guangdonghua? Okay.
So, and it's historic. It's very interesting because, and you can see, I speak some Cantonese and have learned it, and you can see this. The difference of learning Mandarin, especially kind of modern Putonghua and Cantonese, is you can kind of find these historical connections because modern Putonghua is an artificial language. That Cantonese has a lot more kind of historical connections and kind of reverberations through time that really kind of connect you with that original community and how it was spread across China and how it used to be a lot more kind of influential. There's some amazing literature from the previous imperial dynasties of various kind of northern emperors complaining about the restive Cantonese speakers in the south, that they're always kind of a headache for whoever's in power in Beijing, which is kind of really interesting as it kind of echoes into kind of the 90s and 20s with Hong Kong.
So I don't want to keep you up. Maybe we can continue this conversation later on. But I also noticed that in your book you mentioned there are 1,300 sounds in Mandarin and there are 1,800 in Cantonese, and anyway, I should probably hold off to later on. But anyway, I want to mention there are more tones, and that you say in the book. Okay, so I should probably let you get back to your presentation.
Oh no, thank you very much. I appreciate your questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Great. So I think our next question is from Laura. If you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Okay. All right, hello. So I was very interested in really everything you had to say, James and Mr. Griffiths, about the revitalization of the Welsh language. And I feel there's lessons there for Native American groups who are trying to revitalize their languages, which are dying out because there are fewer and fewer native speakers of them that are really using the languages as communication. And it seems like one of the big problems for these people in the United States, of course, is the total domination of English in the cultural sphere, and also that these efforts are very fragmented, divided between a lot of different tribal groups trying to make sure that their languages don't die out. But they didn't have a big unified effort like you had on Welsh, and to get it into law as well as into schools. So it's I don't know how transferable those strategies would be in the United States. I mean, there are a lot of efforts around in the country to say teach the Native American languages in colleges. That's going on in different places. It's Cherokee and other languages. But it just seems like it's such an uphill struggle for the people that are trying to do it.
Yeah, I mean it's very difficult because as a kind of toolbox, the Welsh story it is applicable, but you have to have a certain level of political power to affect it, and also obviously the problem in mainland North America is that you have, like you said, you have kind of diverse and kind of sparsely distributed language communities and populations. One of the reasons that kind of Hawaiian has had some success in language revitalization, even though it's still threatened, is that obviously Hawaii is a contained community, and people can you can kind of set policy for Hawaii, and you're not competing against a bunch of other native languages, where if you to try and do it in, say, kind of the Midwest or parts of the Western Plains in America, you potentially have multiple languages which could make a case for being promoted. And what's interesting is you see a similar problem, particularly in Australia, where there is a desire, and there has been a kind of real kind of good efforts, I think, by the government in Australia to want to promote Australian Indigenous languages. But the problem is you have so many Australian Indigenous languages that you end up in a situation where no one wants the other language to get chosen as the language of, say, Sydney or a particular area. And what ends up happening is you don't really get any of them promoted, and that's part of the problem. Is you need that kind of solidarity and agreement within these language communities, or really ideally for a minority language to succeed, it's the only one in the community, because then there's it's very easy to have, say, in Hawaii, we see you see Hawaiian used on signs, and no one's saying, well, actually, this should be another language. But it can be a pity, I think, sometimes that the competition between minority languages can be problematic. But also, there are other countries where you will see multiple languages promoted. In India, you sometimes see signs in India that have 6 or 7 languages on them, because that's how diverse the local population is. So you could promote more than one language at once, but it's difficult, and then it's difficult to make a case for funding and for kind of acceptance of that. But I think it is a pity. I think it's a real pity, especially in kind of colonial states like the US and Australia and Canada, where I think there would be interest from the majority population as well as these minority communities to to speak some of this language. I think I know certainly Australians and Canadians, and I imagine Americans as well, would be interested in being able to speak and be exposed to the indigenous languages of the country that they live in, and kind of have that kind of connection to the pre-colonial home of that country, history of that country. And I think that I don't know necessarily that you would ever see the success of Welsh, but you could see some self-perpetuating success if you had it on signs, and you're entering a community and you're saying, well, this is now the Ojibwe speaking part of the country, and you see it on some signs, and it could be a boon to that language, and I think it would be of interest. But again, it comes down to political power and organizing.
Yeah, we had a speaker here a while back for the museum who Greg knows the person. He could probably speak to it more than me, but this fellow um, did his dissertation on looking at one of the Native American languages of tribes that lived in the area near Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Delaware, and yet they didn't have any native speakers left in these groups. And so this fellow studied the structure of the language. He found some old texts and things like that. And he actually wrote like a textbook for teaching the language to these people who had completely lost their language. And they were very excited about it, to have something to work with in their schools. So it just seems like it's a big challenge, and the groups that want to revitalize their languages need to organize and advocate for resources, uh, to make it happen. Because without that, it's not going to happen. I think
One thing that is interesting is that I touched it very briefly in the book, that there was reporting in Canada, and particularly that with when the COVID pandemic started, there was actually a real it was actually a real boon for several minority language projects, because they'd previously been doing teaching in the community, and they were forced to go online because of COVID, and then discovered that actually there were a lot of speakers of this indigenous language around Canada who were very interested in participating, but obviously weren't, Canada's so huge geographically, they weren't able to come and take part in person. But once they made it an online project, there was a lot more engagement, and there were people who were living in cities and were saying, oh yeah, I spoke this as a kid, but I've since moved to like Toronto or Montreal, and I can't speak it, but I'm really happy to do these like language sessions, get-togethers online. And so you really, that can really help, because obviously part of all of these like language minoritization kind of stories, it is also an economic story, right? It's generally that people move away from their communities, or that they can't speak that language professionally, so they start speaking the majority language. And so if you can kind of create space for people to use these languages, that has a real effect.
Yeah, the one area where there has been so you could say mass cultural attention to some of the Native American languages in film, because there's actually been quite a few films made, commercial films that have been made with people speaking the actual language of the Native Americans in the films. And some of them have been commercially successful. Others, it's really hard to find them, but they're out there.
There's
So
a whole industry for Navajo.
yeah.
Navajo has really developed well. There's films in Navajo and everything. They've really been a huge success story.
Hmm. Yeah.
And even like, I think it's become much more normal that if you are having, even if it's a primarily an English language film, but you have someone who would be speaking an indigenous language, they actually speak it, right? Instead of having them just speak English in an accent. And so even that is kind of a boon for visibility.
There's another really interesting aspect of revitalizing these languages is the cultural aspect of it, because when the languages carry cultural information that's lost when people don't speak them anymore. I mean, the vocabulary that's used and practices, beliefs, and all of that. So it's certainly, and I think as a historian and linguist myself, it's so important to preserve these sources of cultural information, and not just to allow these languages to kind of die off, because it's part of the heritage of humanity.
Yeah,
Anyway,
no, absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation. And I didn't really know much about the Welsh situation, so I learned a lot from your talk, and I think it's very inspiring that people were
Thank
able
you.
to organize, and then by demanding power, really, I mean, to get some things done. They've accomplished a lot.
May I ask another question? This is Wei again.
Go for it.
Yeah. So Mr. Griffiths is living in Hong Kong, correct? Currently. I'm just
Yes.
wondering whether you were there last decade, during all the demonstrations.
Yeah. So I've been here since 2014. So I arrived just before the umbrella movement in 2014.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Everything since.
So I imagine that the sentiments are really subdued. Now the communist government, if you will, has a presence there. I guess vocalization of discontent is frowned upon, if not outright punished.
Yeah, and that's another thing that's kind of threatened, or kind of puts the future of Cantonese more in question, is that, organizing around Cantonese really kind of technically shouldn't be political, kind of not from Beijing's perspective. It shouldn't be a threat to Beijing's rule. But any kind of independent political organizing in Hong Kong is very difficult and sensitive. We've seen that since even just this last couple of weeks in the wake of the fire in Taibo, that people trying to organize for a independent government inquiry and stuff have been suppressed. And so the problem is that while government policy at the moment is not too it is still supportive of Cantonese, that were there to be a shift, the degree to which the freedom that people have to kind of push back against that is exceptionally limited. And also, I think there is a concern in Beijing, or a sensitivity to the fact that at this point, when they're with the concerns around separatism and kind of Hong Kong drifting away from Beijing's influence during the protest era, that Cantonese very much is something that now is kind of the main distinguishing factor between Hong Kong and the rest of the country. That China is, while obviously there are second languages that people speak, China is almost entirely a first language Mandarin country at this point, whereas Hong Kong is a first language Cantonese territory. And so I think that has really politicized the language in a way that it wasn't only a couple of decades ago, and so that that really raises questions around kind of how you promote this language without being seen as kind of dangerously or even illegally promoting it.
So, as I mentioned earlier, about the arts, I'm extremely interested in the Tang period, because there were about 50,000 poems written during those 300 years, and I imagine that it was because the emperor actually invited all the scholars at the time to just wine and dine in the palace. So there's a lot of history behind the Cantonese language, and I'm just thinking that might be an angle to keep it alive. And I can tell you, so Cantonese has 6 tones, and 4 of those are musical notes. So Cantonese is actually more lyrical than Mandarin, if you can imagine a difference or appreciate the difference.
Yeah, and even away from the spoken language, with we're Hong Kong is now the last place in China that uses traditional characters, and that you have a situation with people that grow up reading simplified characters can't read classical poetry because it's written in traditional or even older forms of Chinese. So there is a real strong link to the past there, but yeah, I don't know if that bears true when it, if it that and that's the real concern is if it comes up against questions of national security or national sovereignty, they will always win out over everything else, and so it's a real delicate situation of kind of promoting this language as a cultural and historical and kind of regional product without kind of stepping over those sensitivities that will like cause Beijing to crack down.
Yeah, and I do remember in your book, you did mention that the southern part of China was the Yue, right? The non-Chinese tribes that were colonized by the remnants of the Qin emperor, right? So the history in that area, I think, goes back to the first century BC when that happened, the colonization happened. So there's a lot of tradition, I believe, and even linguistic remnants from the founding dynasty. So that might be something that could interest people in preserving the language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we can talk for hours, but one more thing I want to just interject is my father was born in Canton in 1934, and I give him a lot of credit for. Sorry,
carry on.
So I give my father a lot of credit for actually leaving the mainland when he came of age. Okay, and so he went to Hong Kong in the early 50s, and then I think he saw the handwriting on the wall, and he brought the family over to America in the early 70s. So I don't want to denigrate anybody, but there's some systems that are just not very tolerant. Okay, not inclusive,
Yeah.
I suppose.
And that's why there's such a huge Cantonese diaspora as well, right? It's because this was the community that spread out almost the most across the world. I mean, Guangdong and Fujian were real drivers of the Chinese diaspora community all over the world because people have spread out everywhere, and you are seeing efforts that it's particularly since 2019 in Hong Kong, because of these concerns about the potential future of the language here. You see real efforts in the diaspora community. There's a big kind of Cantonese project at one of the universities in British Columbia in Canada, and there have been efforts in some American universities to build kind of Cantonese departments and programs to do language kind of preservation and promotion within the diaspora. Yeah,
I understand that Vancouver, British Columbia, has a large population of expats from Hong Kong.
Yeah. I mean, to the extent that it's, some people call it Hongkouver, and some communities you can get by just speaking Cantonese in Vancouver. So.
All right, and then I actually had a question as well, which was just, in your opinion, what are some strategies that might get young people interested in studying the Welsh language, like beyond what opportunities they have in school, but to really developing a passion and excitement for the language so it'll be something that they can integrate into their lives? Like, I'm wondering if there have been initiatives that involved a lot of use of social media, since young people tend to be very online using services like Instagram or TikTok. You had mentioned during the pandemic as well that people had come together through virtual events, which actually were able to bring more people together than just trying to hold events in person. So I'm wondering if, just the technology has played a role in the revitalization and, could be a strategy going forward.
Yeah, definitely has played a role. There are kind of Welsh language accounts and popular accounts on social media, and there's a guy called Dr. Cymraeg who's quite popular, who does a lot of stuff around the Welsh language and kind of educational comedic content around it. Also just this kind of increasing number of Welsh bands and popular culture that's created. And I think also particularly, kind of younger people, kind of university age and into their 20s, people, it helps that this is kind of connected to a political movement, so that this is something that people can organize behind and, get kind of stuck into, and so that, the independence movement in Wales is very much linked to the Welsh language movement. Is a Welsh language first movement, and so a lot of kind of people become inspired by that, or they, are kind of maybe supporters of Welsh independence or greater Welsh autonomy, and through that they become involved in Welsh language activism and using it. And so we're really seeing that. I think also, I'm conflicted on how I feel about Duolingo, but I think unfortunately I talk about it in the book, and I'm probably too positive about it in the book because they've made some changes since then, which are less encouraging. But certainly that to have things like Duolingo, and you have Welsh on Duolingo and stuff, to have things like that are lowering the bar to accessing the language and doing a bit of language learning and picking it up, that does make a difference. And things like even just having it in Google Translate so that people can quickly translate a phrase and send it to friends and stuff, or things like that accessibility, I think, helps people engage with it, and that, and also just awareness, visibility of the language encourages people to then pick it up and use it. Or people learn a few things in Welsh. They learn, the stereotypical thing that all Welsh learners learn for some reason is dwi'n hoffi coffee, which means I like coffee. But people have a little bits, and then they maybe they pick up more, and then as you lower the bar to learning that language, then people want to kind of engage with it more.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think, some of our language scholars here may have a differing opinion, but my feeling is always that anything that lowers the barriers to entry is a good thing in general, especially if it just gets people aware of a language and sparks interest, and maybe teaches them a few words of vocabulary. It's not a stopping point for people to think, oh, now I'm fluent because I did Duolingo, but they may spark enough interest to study it, in a more academic way or a more practical way. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And then I think we have another question from Russ, if you want to come on and ask your question.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Griffiths, you mentioned Yiddish as a at-risk language. It was originally spoken in Europe. I think now it's spoken in Hasidic communities throughout the world. It lost the battle in Israel to become the language there. If it's revitalized, where do you envision it to be, like the center of the language that you need to have, I guess, for it to thrive? Thank you.
Yeah, Yiddish is really, really interesting. I have a chapter in the book, what I call an aside in the book, which is about three which I class as kind of three Jewish languages, which is Yiddish, modern Hebrew, and Esperanto, which was created by originally by a Jewish creator. And Yiddish of those was when they're all kind of when the other two were created, or modern Hebrew, some people would argue it was revitalized, that Yiddish was by far the most widely spoken, with millions of speakers. Obviously, the Holocaust wiped out a huge proportion of that first language community. But then, when the state of Israel was created, it was very aggressively and violently suppressed in Israel. You had Yiddish theaters bombed, and there was a real kind of, once the government took charge, there was a real aggressive promotion of modern Hebrew over Yiddish. And I actually always point to Yiddish now as Yiddish is kind of a classic example in Israel itself of this thing that happens with a lot of minority languages. They're very aggressively suppressed to a point where they're no longer a political threat or a political kind of factor, and then they become almost a museum object. So there is a degree of that in Israel now, where Yiddish is kind of held up as this historic Jewish language that isn't really spoken here that much, even though one of the reasons it's not spoken in Israel is because of aggressive government policy in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But yeah, like you said, there are still large Yiddish speaking communities in the Jewish diaspora, and New York has a surprising number of Yiddish speakers, both in the Hasidic community, like you said, but also even kind of among secular Jews who are kind of descended from Yiddish speakers in Europe. There's an interesting degree of kind of within the kind of assimilation or distinction kind of argument within kind of modern Judaism of that Yiddish speakers tend to be more diaspora focused, less Zionist than Hebrew speakers, and so there's kind of almost that it kind of maps that political divide within modern Judaism. But yeah, if it was revitalized, it would be quite difficult because it is quite politicized, and you would be combining quite different communities of, very traditional Hasids and kind of very secular anti-Zionist, kind of younger Jews who are interested in Yiddish as a kind of historical, cultural language. But I think it would be a tragedy, I think, to lose it as a language of the community because it was the language of Judaism for such a long time that it would be so hopefully there will be kind of more efforts, and I know there are real efforts of Yiddish language newspapers and Yiddish language content that's created online today, and kind of an effort to get younger Jews to speak it.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think for the moment that is all the questions we have in the queue. So we can.
I just wanted to point out that I've added some links in the chat to our past events on our website. One of them was the one that Laura mentioned. It was Dr. Keith Cunningham who wrote the textbook for learning Nanticoke. And we also have a complete section of our website on language preservation, which includes Hawaiian language preservation work, as well as others in the United States and native language preservation. So thank you. This has been really fascinating.
Great, thank you, and thank you everyone for your questions.
And it's really good to know that for us to spread the word, to the people who are working with minority languages is helpful. That
yeah, and it makes a huge difference. And I think there is always an underestimation of how much these kind of little things make a difference. I spoke to some media around, was it last year, a couple of years ago. There was a push in. Must have been a few years ago, actually, because it was a push in New Zealand, and it was the Labour government who have since left power. But a push in New Zealand to have more Maori on signs, and this kind of, this was denounced by the right wing in New Zealand as, this was just kind of woke posturing to put it on signs. But it really does make a difference. Welsh is kind of proof of that those slight improvements in visibility and awareness do lead to tangible results down the line, because it gets people interested, or it inspires people to speak a language that maybe they used to speak as a kid and they want to use it more, and so these tiny, what feel like really tiny steps do make progress.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Oh, I just want to ask Mr. Griffiths. So I was born in Hong Kong, and what I tell people is, yes, I was British. I grew up in an oppressive environment, my mom's house. Okay, but so, jokes aside, so I was curious about the British government's recent recognition of BNOs. Right, they recognize what happened in the last decade, and they actually have a website for people born before 1997 to apply to emigrate to Great Britain. I don't know whether you've seen any interest in Hong Kong in recent years.
Yeah, and there was a huge outflow of people after 2020 when this program was introduced. I don't know the contemporary statistics, but it's been hundreds of thousands of people have moved from Hong Kong to the UK. And this was largely kind of very overdue reversal of one of the more shameful things the Brits did in the run-up to the handover, which was to essentially strip everyone in Hong Kong of their British citizenship, which they'd had until that point, because they were worried so many Hong Kongers would come to the UK, and it was just kind of a nakedly racist policy to stop British Hong Kongers moving to the UK. And so after 2020, they introduced this pathway, and there's large Hong Kong communities now in the UK, and they've been very successful.
And I also believe that even the children of the pre-1997 Hong Kongers are eligible to apply as well. So, I mean, I see that as a glimmer of hope.
Yeah, there is a pathway. Yeah, and a lot of people have gone over. Unfortunately, I think the UK is not in great economic or other shape, so it has not been as successful for some people as they hoped. But yeah, a lot of people definitely have moved.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
I'd like to, I'd like to ask Mr. Griffiths, what's next? Are you going to go back into language work, or are you going to focus on something else now?
I'm still interested in language, but I'm primarily a journalist, and I cover Asia, so I write a number of things. My previous book was about censorship and the Great Firewall of China, and so I write about a variety of things. I am working on another potential book, which is just a kind of a history, a non-fiction story. So it's I would like to write something more about language, but it's about kind of finding the project and interesting. So I've written about a couple of times when I worked for CNN. I wrote some pieces about efforts in Australia and some other stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
But if people are interested, well, I've still got the slide up. People are interested, there's my website there is jamesdgriffiths.com, which has information about my work and my other book as well. And if people speak Spanish, this Speak Not is in Spanish. It has a bonus chapter in Spanish. So.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
We'll go ahead and close the recording now.